Good morning. In Matthew 23, verses 2 to 3, it says, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do." That's when reading the law of Moses. "But do not copy their ways, for they say and do not." Jesus told us to beware of becoming Pharisees. Why? Well, they were teaching the law of God and expecting others to observe it exactly, but they didn't keep it themselves. They didn't walk the talk. Jesus called them hypocrites and very often verbally scathed them, calling them whited sepulchres and a brood of vipers. In Romans 2, verse 6, we read that God will render to every man according to his deeds, because there's no respecter of persons with God. The more we know of what God wants from us, the more is required. If we know what God is requiring of us and we don't do it, then we've no excuse when we stand before him. We may not call ourselves Pharisees, but if we teach one thing and do another, then we might as well. You don't need to have a particular title like pastor or reverend to be a teacher. Parents and grandparents are teachers too. And to be honest, parents have far more influence where forming our character is concerned than anyone else, because actions speak louder than words. The Bible's a great book, as it doesn't hide the imperfections of the people God chose and used. God chose Abraham, Isaac and Jacob to start a brand new nation who were to be the people of God. Yet, if you look at the life of Jacob as he was growing up, you would be appalled at his treachery. Jacob was the younger twin when born, but throughout his life he always hankered for the birthright and blessing of the firstborn. His older brother Esau had been out hunting one day and came home famished and faint, so Jacob seized the opportunity and actually got him to sell his birthright for a bowl of stew. But that wasn't enough for Jacob. He wanted it all and just waited for another opportunity to present itself. Well, some years later, Jacob's mother, Rebecca, overheard a conversation where Isaac, her husband, told Esau to hunt venison, then make him a meal of it, and after he'd eaten, he would give him the blessing, as he felt sure his time had come to die. So Esau ran off to do his father's bidding, but Rebecca was in a panic. The birth of these children had been a miracle, for she'd been barren 20 years before God opened her womb. But during the pregnancy, God told her that two nations were fighting for supremacy in her womb and that the elder would end up serving the younger. Rebecca kept this in her heart, but now she'd overheard this conversation, she had to do something before it was too late, as once the blessing was given, there'd be no way to overturn it. She called Jacob, who was her favoured son, to go to the flock and bring her 2 kids. She told him she'd make the food for Isaac just as he liked it, and Jacob could take it in, posing as Esau to get the blessing. Now, Isaac was blind, but even Jacob knew that though he couldn't see, he'd know who it was by the voice. He'd know it was Jacob and not Esau. And he pointed out that his brother was a very hairy man, and he himself had smooth skin. But Rebecca had it all under control and bound strips of the animal's skin upon his arms and the back of his neck so that he'd feel hairy to the touch. She even gave him some of Esau's clothes to wear so that he'd smell like his brother. She did everything she possibly could to trick her husband into thinking that Jacob was Esau. Jacob was still not convinced that this deception would work, and he'd end up being cursed rather than blessed. But Rebecca reassured him by saying that if her plan didn't work and Jacob cursed her son instead of blessing him, then the curse would be on herself and not on him. And it was only then that Jacob was prepared to go into his father. What a wicked thing to do. Jacob deceived his blind father into giving him the family blessing and inheritance by pretending to be his brother Esau. You know, the name Jacob literally means supplanter, and the definition of a supplanter is something or someone who wrongfully takes the place of another. Wow, was that name prophetic or what? We criticise Jacob, but he was taught by his mother. It was Rebecca who cheated on her husband to fulfill God's promise to her. She set a really bad example for her son Jacob, whom she also encouraged to deceive his father. She was the parent, she was the teacher, and it was her duty to teach her children godly principles. And it's easy to criticise Rebecca, but this is where the warning of Jesus becomes relevant, because he told us to beware of becoming Pharisees. Why? Because they were in a position of authority, teaching the law of God and expected others to observe it exactly, but they didn't keep it themselves. They didn't walk the talk. They were, in fact, hypocrites. In Romans 2:21 it says, "You who judge stealing, do you also steal?" No, you wouldn't do a thing like that. You're a Christian and wouldn't dream of doing such a thing. Well, I was of the same mindset and truly wanted to live a godly lifestyle. But well before I was married, I remember shopping with a Christian friend. As we went around the store aisles, we saw a packet of raisins which was broken open. My friend stooped down, picked up some of the raisins and popped them into her mouth, grinning at me. I was quite shocked, as to me, this was stealing. But then she stooped down again, picked up some more of the raisins and put them into my hand and motioned for me to eat. Well, I did. And then we both looked at one another and giggled. But from that day onwards, I used to walk down the aisles looking for broken packets to snack on during my shopping expeditions. Even when I had very young children, I'd find this habit really hard to break and would sneakily try to slip a piece of a sweet or a piece of chocolate into my mouth without anybody seeing. But they did see. And without realising what I was doing, I was teaching my children to steal. And I was mortified to find that they were doing it behind my back. It's not only the shopping where you get exposed. What about your behaviour in the home? Do you and your husband argue and fight in front of the children? Do you say unkind things to one another when you get miffed? Do you roll your eyes when you're asked to do something you don't want to do, or when somebody says something which annoys you? Do you shout and bang things when you get frustrated? Do you call people idiots when you're driving, or use 4-letter words when you can't control your temper? What are you exposing of yourself to the people you live with? What you're really like at home? Well, I know one thing for certain. Children copy everything you do, especially when you do things that you're not supposed to do, or you say things that you're not supposed to say. They are little mirrors who reflect everything they see, and they learn best by observing our behaviour, and will do what we do rather than what we say. You've been locked in with your families for a few weeks now. There's no hiding from each other. And I know for some people who don't know God, this has perhaps been the most traumatic time of their lives. I know the suicide rates have gone up, and domestic violence and child abuse, that's increased dramatically. 2020 will be looked back on as a time of hell on earth for some people. But what about you, who are believers and profess to have a walk with God and Jesus Christ? Are you enjoying your time together as a family or as a couple? Or are you now in that state where you feel trapped and you just can't wait for your freedom again? Are you feeling the strain and wanting for everyone to go back to work or school so that you can just have some peace? If you profess to be a Christian but have no peace in your home, then you have become a Pharisee, a hypocrite, without even realising it. What is your lifestyle really teaching? Because actions speak louder than words. If you profess to be a believer and say, "Greater is he that is within me than he that's in the world," or you pray for the sick, believing you have authority to lay hands on the sick and for them to be healed, and yet you're afraid to hug extended family or friends for fear of catching or passing on something, then shame on you. Unless you can live the talk, you're a Pharisee, a hypocrite. if you profess to be a believer but refuse to have face-to-face fellowship with other believers because of a worldly guideline or statutory law, then you're disobedient to God. Paul said in Hebrews 10 that we should not forsake the assemblings of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as we see the day approaching. Can't you see the day approaching? Can't you see that Jesus will be coming soon to judge the ungodly for their unrighteous behaviour? So many churchgoers have formally protested when people say they don't go to church, being adamant that we all need fellowship. They even give the illustration of a single piece of coal that's fallen out of the fire, how it goes cold when it's isolated. Well, shame on you, because at this very time, when we all need to be physically encouraging one another, you're showing by your actions that church is a non-essential service. In other words, it's not relevant. In Tanzania, the churches have actually refused to be under lockdown. When the pastors were told to lock down like everyone else, they refused and remained open because they believe they are essential to the well-being of the country. The Tanzanian president is not only allowing places of worship to remain open, but he's urging people to go and seek refuge and healing there. And I'm going to share a link with you down below for you to see this for yourself. Which of our pastors or church leaders in the UK protested against the lockdown? Their actions speak louder than words. The church is not relevant. How many of us have read stories and applauded testimonies of those who smuggle Bibles through to atheistic countries where it's forbidden to preach about God or hold meetings? We hear of people persecuted for their faith and even threatened with death. Yet they still risk their lives to meet in secret. We call them the underground church and support them with our finance and prayers because we believe that what they're doing is right. What an inspiration these people are, because they're bold and courageous. Daniel was in exactly the same situation as us. A decree went out that nobody was to pray to any other god for 30 days, or else they'd be thrown to the lions. That was the whole of Babylon, and the Babylonians served many gods, so everyone was involved in this law. And Daniel actually worked for the government. He held a very high position. But he was a believer, and he knew exactly where his allegiance lay, even though to disobey meant the death penalty. He continued on as before, and after being thrown into the lion's den, was not only delivered from being eaten, but he brought great honour to his God because of his faith. Listen, nobody's forcing any of us to call ourselves believers, so be honest. We prove our faith by the way we live. It's provable. So make up your mind whether you're going to walk after the flesh or after the spirit. We're all in this circumstance whether we like it or not. But we don't have to dishonour God by pretending to be what we're not. We are living epistles, known and read by everyone. So don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but think soberly according to the faith that you have, like Paul says. Don't profess to be more than you can live. And make sure you don't show yourself to be a Pharisee to those who are watching. Remember, actions speak louder than words. Have a great day.